A pipeline winds its way through Canada right now that virtually no outside of what the energy industry discusses. Despite this, it might be one of the most important components of infrastructure built in the past anywhere on the planet decade. It measures 1,150 kilometers away from Edmonton's oil sands, all the way from Alberta to the Pacific coast in British Columbia's Burnaby. Moreover, on May 1st, 2024, it made a subtle shift in the global energy map. Forever. This is the Trans Mountain story, TMX, or expansion, a project that nearly quadrupled Canada's capacity-only significant pipeline leading to its west coast, reducing it to 30,000 barrels per day increase to 890,000 barrels per day. Furthermore, the repercussions of that one fact are still spreading throughout Asia, all over the world's oil markets, and all over the debate over Canada's own national sovereignty in ways that most people have not fully appreciated, not yet processed. Let's begin with the starting, because the context is important significantly here. Canada has dominated modern history for that has become entangled in one of the most bizarre paradoxes of any major energies economy producer worldwide. The nation of fourth-largest crude oil producer worldwide producer with a 5.76-pound output capacity million barrels per day, but 96% of the total the United States received exports in 2024. Consider that for a moment. Nearly one in every great oil in the world. The flow of reserves is consistent, south to just one client. That does not a business relationship, which is dependence, and Canada paid for it for decades. Sincerely, for it. This is the reason for geography was the dependency. Oil from Canada is confined to Alberta and Saskatchewan, where there are few potential for offshore exports. The fat could not reach the coastlines. Without tankers were not present for coastal access. There were no tankers without them. Alternative purchasers. There is no alternative. Buyers, specifically American refiners. Midwesters in the United States had a huge price control over Canadian oil. They recognized that Canada had no other options and prices were set accordingly. Prior to TMX, almost all of the crude from Canada had to go south into the United States, providing refiners with pricing power close to monopsony, likewise, expanding the WCS-WTI reduction to $25.50 per barrel during limited times. The WTI-WCS. For those unfamiliar, spread is the distinction between Canadian heavy and oil, which is known as Western Canadian Select, actually sells for as opposed to what the U.S. standard for crude oil is in West Texas, at the intermediate trades. You normally would, due to Canada, anticipate a discount. Refining heavy oil is more expensive. But the actual discount that existed was not typical. It involved a structural punishment from a captive supply arrangement. And, in its worst form, in October of that year, that gap grew to $43 per barrel, implying that Canadian manufacturers' tens of billions of dollars were left behind, on the table each and every year only because it was impossible to obtain their product in another location. The Trans Mountain Pipeline had existed as a whole since 1953. The company was established in 1951. In 1952, construction began, and business operations began in 1953. The only pipeline that connects these two locations. It moved oil quietly for 7 decades, from the coast of BC to Alberta, but its capacity was constrained. Undeniably, Alberta's oil sands became widespread worldwide. Production unit, that one dated pipeline, was simply insufficient. In 2013, a proposal to expand it was made. Pipeline company Kinder Morgan, based in Texas firm that was the owner of Trans Mountain, applied to the National Energy System of Canada Board to basically split the current line. In 2016, the project was approved. However, it then collided head-on with Canada's incredibly difficult collision of Indigenous politics, environmental rights law, and disputes over jurisdiction between the provincial and federal governments. Of British Columbia. The provincial government opposed it. Environmentalists opposed it, and some it was fought by First Nations. And in 2018, confronted with an avalanche of legal opposition Kinder Morgan concluded that it could not construct the pipeline as an independent business and announced its withdrawal. This is when the federal government of Canada carried out one of the most significant interventions in the economy of the nation history. The pipe was bought by Ottawa. The Trudeau administration purchased the project for $4.5 billion from Kinder Morgan in 2018. The reasoning was clear. If no private business could get around the politics, the government would intervene to obtain the project was made. It was a wager, a highly large, highly visible, and ultimately highly costly wager on the strategic significance of providing Canada's oil with to the Pacific. Exit. What came next was years of hell during construction. Supply chains were disrupted by COVID-19 and workforces, floods and wildfires in the delays caused by British Columbia across the duration of the project. Costs increased with each delay. Every additional cost required additional funding. Construction was also affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, as floods and wildfires. The initial estimate of the budget when the project was first proposed by Morgan and been approximately $5.4 billion. When the Golden Weld was completed early in 2024, the TMX was first developed. Anticipated cost of 5.4 billion Canadian dollars and ultimately cost 34 to more than $6 billion Canadian multiplied by the initial estimate. That price, one of the most significant, is overrun. In the history of Canadian infrastructure, and we will return to its significance for Canadians who pay taxes. However, first, let's discuss the pipeline's actual nature. Upon opening, the Mountain of the Trans. In May, the expansion project went live. 2024, bringing the total capacity of the Trans Mountain chain totaling 890,000 barrels daily. This made the total exports of crude oil from Western Canada capacity of the pipeline by 13% and the capacity to export to Tidewater in approximately 700% in Western Canada. The number at the end is the one that deserves some time to think about it. 700%. Canada's capacity to transport oil via tankers, effectively exporting to global markets 0 before D, divided by a number of 8 in a single month. The industry responded pretty quickly. Since the first month of TMEP's expansion, Trans Mountain's expanded system average utilization of 82%. More generally, all of our restrictions have been lifted. The largest export pipelines in Canada span over this time, and crude oil from Canada prices have gone up in comparison to international guidelines. Inside the combined pipeline's first month, 704,000 were already being transported, barrels per day, or 81% of what it can handle. Throughput reached a record high of, by March 2025, 793,000 barrels daily. Due to the rapid filling of the pipeline, the requirement that had always existed stifled for decades due to a lack of infrastructure, which suddenly existed someplace to go. And most importantly, the cost increase started to shrink. The distinction. In 2024, the gap between WTI and WCS narrowed to a median of $14.73 per barrel in comparison to 2023, a median of $18.65 per barrel, which reflects the beginning of the in May 2024 for the TMX pipeline. That may appear to be a modest step. However, when talking about millions of barrels that are flowing daily, a few dollars per barrel even is enormous. The difference in cost between Western WTI and Canada Select were reduced significantly at the end of 2024, about $8 per barrel, a lot less than gaps in the past. Central Alberta projects that this oil was spread more narrowly. Revenues by about $7 billion in 2024 since TMX opened, approximately $10 billion Canadian, or adding a 13th month of the year's production. In effect, Alberta received a bonus month of revenue as a result of the pipeline opened. That's the strength of infrastructure. The numbers kept going up. Improved into 2025. Since the start of the WCS-WTI and the expanded TMX pipeline, the spread has decreased by approximately $6 per barrel in general. The decrease in the oil discount resulted in more money from oil, about $9 billion US dollars, during the initial between the operation of the TMX expansion April 2025 and May 2024. That is expressed in Canadian dollars. Number exceeds $13 billion. For context, which is a global economic impact not only in corporate profits, but in Alberta's royalty payments government in terms of Ottawa's tax revenues and in the wages of all employees in the oil sands and associated sectors. TD has proposed increasing oil production. This year's increase will range from 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points to the entire GDP of Canada. It anticipates that Alberta's real GDP will rise by 1.9% in 2024, only behind PEI and Newfoundland, and exceeding the by a significant margin. GDP growth forecast for the nation of 1.1%. Canada faced economic challenges in the year, headwinds from multiple directions. Oil sector was one of the ones that TMX accelerated. The few shining areas of the national economic situation. Let's talk about that now. Where the oil is going, considering that this is where the narrative truly develops geopolitical. The initial goal of TMX was to eliminate Canada's reliance on a single client from the United States and a wide-open route to Asia. That aspiration has been partially realized, and the course is moving faster in methods that are changing trade connections across the Pacific. Between September 2025 and May 2024, exports of crude oil to the Indo-Pacific markets increased from almost nothing to an 571 million Canadian dollars on average each month. China rose to the position of second-largest location for Canadian crude following the U.S., with $5.9 billion from Canada exports between May 2024 and now, as well as September 2025, representing 61% of exports to the Indo-Pacific. Other potential new customers in the area included $1.6 billion for Singapore, Hong Kong, at $1.5 Hong Kong billion from Canada, South Korea at $411 million Canadian, and India at $158 million Canadian. China became the market leader in accounting for 70.6% of TMX oil exports to markets outside the U.S. from January to March of 2025, and the trend is becoming more rapid. Canadian with oil is now entering Pacific tidewater. The flow of goods to Asia continues to rise as refineries in China emerge as the most popular location for TMX exports, which account for roughly half all crude. TMX crude exports to countries other than the United States increased from 3% of all exports prior to the TMX to nearly 9% by 2025, with China taking over roughly 51% of all seaborne shipments. Why China in particular? There are reasons structural that go beyond just the cost. The refinery system in China, combining majors owned by the state with a large and aggressive in business, one of the few in the independent sector, the world that can take in heavy sour grades on the TMX scale, such as WCS can perform. Its infrastructure for storage enables purchasing that is anti-cyclical, reduces the volatility of demand. Chinese refineries are designed for the type of oil that emerges from the oil sands of Alberta are heavy, dense, sulfide-rich crude that calls for sophisticated refinement, but it produces strong petroleum product yields. And the location works. Westridge's to China takes about 17 days to get there, to 22 days, which is significantly less than that for routes from numerous rival suppliers. Additionally, a strategic dimension that Beijing fully comprehends well. Russian oil imports by China increased by 26% in 2024 to 108 million tons, making China the top buyer in Russia, representing 47% of Russian crude exports. However, this dependence on Russia oil makes things vulnerable. The sanctions could get worse. The Moscow's geopolitical relationship, and despite its transactional nature, Beijing is not possible. 19% of China's oil comes from Russia and 33% of Middle Easterners in 2024, making it vulnerable to instability in global politics. China has taken measures to address this vulnerability. Attempted to diversify its crude oil supply sources in accordance with its policy of more than 20% of its crude oil comes from imports, from any individual nation. Canada, politically ruled by the rule of law stable and now easily obtainable via the Pacific tanker route, is appealing. Chinese have a choice for diversification. Planners of energy. In the meantime, the larger the geopolitical context is causing. Crude from Canada is more appealing to almost every major economy in Asia. If Middle Eastern traffic continues uncertain, South Korea and Japan may be willing to spend more on barrels coming from an area with stable politics. Canada is liked by suppliers, even though freight Pacific-wide costs remain significant. The Hormuz Strait, through which a large portion of the world's oil supply flows, and it becomes increasingly difficult to move. Point. Disruptions in that region's supply send every nation that imports energy here. Asia is looking for other options quickly. Canada, which exports to the Pacific terminal, is becoming more and more one of those alternatives. There's also the tanker surge in traffic that causes all of this incredibly real. Towards the end of the year, 2025, tanker. The Westridge Terminal's traffic had increased by more than 800% since expansion was put into use. 23 vessels on average each month began their journey at the Westridge Marine Terminal from July 2025 to June 2024. This terminal was barely available before TMX, important for international oil shipping. Now it is a real hub for Pacific exports. Yet, the picture is not all glory. We must be analytical because the truthful story requires dealing with some unpleasant realities. To begin, the concern regarding diversification. The Canadians were offered the pipeline in part as a means of breaking free from the United States. More is the truth. Nuanced. Approximately 214 million oil was transported through the Transcending Mountain expansion to the United States from May 2024 to December of 2025. This indicates that during the initial 19 months following the completion of the pipeline, and 60% on average of the new oil exported capacity served customers in the U.S. An MP for the NDP who obtained the Crown's data? The company that owns Trans Mountain directly. This demonstrates that we have not diversified the markets for our exports. To be fair to those who support the pipeline, the trend line is altering itself. Asia's imports increased from 32% in 2024 to 47% in TMX 2025. The path is well defined, but the change is taking longer than many anticipated. Second, there is the issue of weather logistics. The marine terminal at Westridge Burnaby was not built to accommodate most common type of oil tanker in the world. Because the Vancouver port can handle only the smaller tankers of the Aframax, over half of the oil was initially transported to California, where it is now transferred to VLCC tankers that are much larger. There is a limit of 600,000 cargoes, barrels for each Aframax ship. The greatest 2 million barrels of can be carried by VLCC's oil. The cost of this transshipment route rises. And complexity, as well as the fact that Canada not yet accounting for the entire benefit of a large-scale tanker directly transport to Asia. It's a hole in the infrastructure that prevents the pipeline's capacity for efficiency deliver. Third and politically most charged is the situation with the money. Project as a whole, the overrun in costs from $5.4 billion. One of the most is to $34.2 billion, significant in the history of Canada. On the government is losing money. TMX, due to the oil-paid tolls, contracts form the basis of businesses. First executed in 2012 that do not completely cover the cost of building the pipeline. Canadian only $15.4 billion of the Canadian $34.2 billion. The pipeline's cost in dollars is covered via tolls. If rates for tolls are not increased, taxpayers in Canada could lose between CAD and 8.7 Canadian dollars, $18 billion, or between 581 and 1,255 Canadian dollars a subsidy per household for the oil's transportation costs industry. This is not a blip on the page. This is an opportunity for wealth transfer. From oil to homes in Canada, businesses on a large scale, and the toll rates were still up for discussion. Performing well in regulatory hearings into 2025, Trans Mountain will exist on June 30, 2024. Reported that its assets were worth $37 billion, debt totaling $26 billion, and equity of $8.8 billion. The Parliamentary of Canada Trans Mountain was estimated by the Budget Officer to have a value of $33.4 billion if contracts with long terms are renewed after, if they are not, $29.6 billion in 2040. Ottawa, which purchased the pipeline to It Built It and always said it would sell, now confronts the unpleasant fact that its potential selling price may be considerably less than what the project costs to construct. The next option is the issue of who will purchase it. Federal law. In 2019, the government announced its purpose to investigate the possibility of 129 people's economic participation was affected. Indigenous populations. Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Finance, presented a strategy for selling a stake in the pipeline system to communities that are eligible through a vehicle with a special purpose. They would not need to put any of their own at risk. Money to take part. However, Indigenous groups have been waiting for more information from federal officials regarding how and when the promise of equity will be kept. This Indigenous ownership remains a possibility. One of the most significant and unanswered issues elements of the TMX narrative, a possibility instrument for reconciliation by empowerment in the economy that has so far resulted in more waiting than doing. In the meantime, the U.S. tariff climate introduced by the administration of Trump already added a new dimension to this intricate picture. 2025's first half was marked by threats from tariffs and unprecedented economic prolonged conflicts and uncertainty, causing a fluctuation in oil prices in some way more volatile than most expected. Canada was hit with tariffs on a wide range of its merchandise sold in the United States, putting a lot of pressure on to accelerate the TMX's diversification was intended to facilitate a pipeline to Asia. Suddenly was not just a chance to make money. This was a strategic requirement. Each barrel that has the potential to go to China or South Korea rather than entering the United States escaped the tariff as a barrel. Canada's regime was strengthened, hand for negotiating. Export driven by TMX total diversification is rising. Volumes as opposed to moving U.S.-bound trade. Exports from the U.S. and abroad are rising as non-U.S. growth picks up from 4.9% in 2024 to 8.8% in 2025, indicating boosting one's self-assurance. The conduit is not stealing from the American market. It is increasing Canada's overall capacity for export and creation of real, first time in the history of the nation's past as an oil exporter. During the first year of the opening of the pipeline, total crude oil quantities shipped through British Columbia's growth exceeded sixfold. In the same time frame, crude oil shipments to countries other than the U.S. accounted for 48.1% of the volume of exports. The Canadian Bank estimated that the total exports from Canada, 6.25% of growth will occur over the second half of 2024, on average, led by exports of oil because of the new capacity that the Trans Mountain created expansion. Furthermore, looking further out, the economic projections are significant. Taxes could rise by $55 billion as a result of TMX, and royalties from 2024 to, in Canada, 2043, that represents a shift across generations in national income generated by a part of the infrastructure. In addition, the oil sands of Alberta are entering a new growth phase. Canada's energy regulator says crude oil statistics for the year-to-date production through the summer of 2024. 5.0 million barrels per day on average, the highest ever, an increase from 4.8 million barrels per day on average in the year 2023. An increase in production from year to year between 100,000 and 300,000 additional barrels per day will continue into 2025, which will make one of the largest suppliers of global growth in crude oil output. Before TMX, that increase in production would have made the shortage of supplies worse and the reduced cost and enhanced American refiners at the expense of Canada. It now enters a pipeline that connects the world to it. Since now, startup of TMEP, Canada's rail transport of crude exports are now below the average for the year, levels not seen in more than 10 years. Rail had been an expensive, ineffective, and a carbon-intensive alternative for the pipeline restriction, transporting oil via train throughout the nation to reach export markets. That era has ended. The liquid that used to stomp its way across the prairies on now, freight trains move without incident, directly to Pacific via a pipe tankers. The question that all of the energy industry wants to know, what's next? The Alberta, and in November 2025, a memorandum was signed by federal governments of comprehending and committing to greater collaboration between governments in the energy comprising investigating the possibility of a new pipeline from BC to the coast. However, First and the provincial government of BC nations opposed the MOU based on a lack of proper discussion, political issues. There are no prerequisites for a second pipeline in place right now. The contrast with coastal First Nations are numerous and significant legally. Indigenous communities keep their positions, limiting oil tanker traffic. Without Native support puts future projects at risk, provoking significant opposition from the public and possibly preventing additional private sector expenditures. However, the economic justification for more capacity is compelling due to the lack of demand in Asia moving on. China's domestic strategy, about 1.4 of the reserves were available, billion barrels by the middle of 2025, a buffer that keeps both demonstrates how much demand China has. For crude as a strategically important asset and the extent to which import volumes eliminate immediate consumption. Despite the country's current trade relation to the United States, American oil, since the pandemic, demand has remained stagnant, whereas demand in Asia, especially in China's expansion, continues. This deeper narrative that TMX presents. It does not about a single pipeline, about a nation becoming aware of the strategic truth about where it is geographically stuck in the middle of a single dominant trade partner to the south and a substantial expansion a continent to the west that needs energy across the Atlantic. One of the pre-TMX baselines was excessive reliance on a single export route. 97% of all jobs will be lost in 2023. The received crude exports from Canada. The United States a level of focus that reflected more than just commercial preference, despite the structural limitation. Canadian manufacturers were not selecting the U.S. market insofar as they were restricted to it because there are no other options alternative. That era has ended. Canada has constructed its own exit. It arrived over budget, late, and through a legal and political maze that would have put an end to most projects at a cost of could eventually require taxpayers to take on losses that no one told them to expect. But it's there. It performs. And more Canadians are born each month. Oil exports to the west over the Pacific and into China's and South Korea's refineries, India and Singapore, two markets that would have been entirely unreachable just too long ago. Data with each passing quarter bolsters its strategic viability and importance. Canada is now part of the Pacific exporter of energy. The oil road leading to Asia is true, and the world is fair getting a sense of what that means.